Hello and welcome to Wessex Museums' first ever podcast series, Interrogating Hardy. This series we will be focusing on Thomas Hardy and if he is the unique hero we, or at least I, would like to think of him as. My name is Harriet Still and I am the Wessex Museums Hardy curator, as well as being the host of this podcast. This aptly named podcast series will question how far his writing did speak about multiple issues, if writing alone was enough to call him an activist, and how this can reflect our own time. Hello listeners, in this episode of Interrogating Hardy, we take a slightly different angle by indulging my interest in clothing, in Hardy's life and novels. From the surviving clothes that we are lucky enough to still have from his mother and sister, to conversations about the significance of certain items of clothing in his writing, we'll be exploring the meaning of clothing in Hardy's Wessex. Disappearing down this rabbit hole with me are Esther Wilson, who is currently studying a PhD in history at the University of York, which is funded by the White Rose College of the Arts and Humanities, and by Jo Wiltcher, who has studied MA fashion curation before working in museums. Jo has a particularly unique perspective on Hardy and clothing, having mounted the costumes for the exhibitions, and has a particular penchant for 19th century smocks as well. So moving on to the episode itself, welcome. It's lovely to see you both here. So glad you could join us.
Hello, thank you for having us.
Hi.
So just to set the scene, so I've got a quote from Hardy from a poem called The Ruined Maid. And the whole premise of this poem is about a girl who's grown up on a farm in Dorset and she goes off to the city, becomes ruined, becomes the mistress of this man, and about how actually visually she becomes better off than she was when she was living kind of what was seen as a moral life on the farm, picking potatoes. And her friend meets her and basically says, "You just look absolutely stunning. How do I get to look like you?" And so we have the line talking about, "You left us in tatters without shoes or socks, tired of digging up potatoes and spudding up ducks. And now you've gay bracelets and bright feathers 3. And her friend replies, "Yes, that's how we dress when we're ruined," said she. And I just think it's a really interesting contrast that Hardy brings in this, about this idea that actually clothing was outwardly expressing your social station at this period, but it could also be this kind of guise that you could put on and you could so easily, with that costume, transcend different social barriers. And so just to start off with, Esther, would you be able to just talk to us a bit about why was clothing so important in this period? What did it signal? What could you tell about someone if you met them on the road walking towards them by what they were wearing?
Well, firstly, I think it's important to consider that this is something that we still think of today. We judge one another by what we wear. If we've got a nice event coming up, we think, what am I going to wear? How are people going to perceive me? If you're going on a night out, if you're going on a date, if you're just in the library and you don't care what people think, what you're going to be wearing. So I think the idea of judging people based on their appearance and their fashion is something that we still think today. I think it's really interesting in that poem excerpt that it's sort of tying into these ideas of perhaps 19th century morality. And the town is a bad place, it's corruption, it's fashionable, and it's all about money and consumption. But it's degrading, it's immoral, she's ruined, as opposed to sort of a pure, simple, rural lifestyle in poverty.
That's a big change at this period, isn't it? Because I think 1851 is the first census where you've got a greater urban population than you have rural population.
Yeah.
And so there's a massive shift happening there with what the town represents and how the countryside is kind of effectively emptying into the town.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a time of industrialization. We're seeing people moving from really rural areas, the majority of people being in rural areas, to it's going to be very different by the end of Hardy's life in the 1920s. We're going to have a much more urban society. And I think that's a point that's really interesting. And it crops up in literature quite a lot, actually. Other authors do comment on this sort of industrialization, the corruption, not only sort of to the physical environment, but the human environment as well. And that's going to be reflected perhaps in the ways that appearances are criticized. I mean, earlier in the Victorian era, the 19th century, there's quite a big polar disparity between rural and urban fashions. But as that century goes on, we're going to be seeing a lot more lines blurred with increasing connections between rural and urban. Not that they were always two completely separate worlds, but some of those lines are going to be challenged, I think. So yeah, it's a really interesting poem.
One of the things that I find really striking for myself and also quite poignant is there's a memory that Hardy has from when he's a teenager and he steals his father's telescope and he goes up onto the heathland and he looks through his telescope, and at 8 o'clock in the morning, this man is being hanged in Dorchester prison. And even though it's 3 miles away, he can see through his telescope the contrast between the white of the man to be hanged standing on top of the gate and then the black of the crowds gathered below. And I think he calls it like an urban black, or the black of the townsfolk. And so that idea also that you've got this kind of, like you said, in the mid-century, before it kind of starts to merge later on, this very, very visual disparity. Then contrasting this with what Esther was saying about the end of the century, I wonder if I can throw in another little Hardy bit here, which is he writes that towards the end of the century, you start to get quite a lot of conflict, I feel, between the town and the country. And this is something we've touched upon on another episode we did. But Hardy feels very much that there's a huge criticism from the urban population of the rural population, who feel that they're stupid, uneducated, basically just sitting around waiting to die in a hovel. And he kind of tries to push back and say, no, these people have dreams, they have ambitions, and they have, I suppose, importantly, a region identity. And he sees that region identity as being really tied up in the clothing they wear. And for that, he really brings in this idea of smocks, but also of wing bonnets, and which I think are now known as more as, we call them sunbonnets, and also of kind of cotton, quite hard wearing, like cotton dresses being then replaced by, I think he calls it a material dress. And I was just wondering, not being a dress historian myself, whether Jo or Esther, you could unpack that a bit, that kind of change from almost like kind of cotton to whatever material dress it is, if you know yourselves.
I mean, I can comment a little bit on the smock side of things. So before the Industrial Revolution, people would normally have used, as I understand it, and I know more about menswear than women, so Esther, you might contradict me here, but as I understand it, people would use the materials that are available to them regionally, which is why you get a sense of regional dress, because people are using, for example, where linen can grow, people are using linen. Where there are sheep farmed, you have wool. But cotton is quite an exotic fabric. It's only through industrialisation that becomes a more common fabric that's used by the working classes. I mean, at the beginning of the century, in the Regency period, cotton muslin is a real luxury fabric. We think of those Regency white cotton muslin dresses, that they're really high-end luxury art garments. But by the end of the century, of course, cotton, as you say, is worn by working classes. So I suppose in terms of the men and the smock frocks, the linen smock frocks would probably, at the point when industrialised clothing is becoming available, would probably mark them out as being rural and traditional and urban. And because they are such a distinctive garment, my research sort of showed that those garments become a tool by which artists and writers can sort of portray a particular type of person, which might not have anything to do with the actual people who wore them, but the smock frock can become a shorthand for those ideas of old-fashioned and behind the times and sort of stuck in the past and traditional, those ideas that become associated with the rural people. Esther, I don't know if you have any comment on that from your perspective.
No, I think you pick up on a variety of really interesting points, and also coming back to this sort of idea of a sort of rural-urban divide. A couple of interesting things to say might be, for example, the second-hand trade, and in obviously industrialisation, we're getting also more ready-made garments available. So if we're thinking about perhaps how fashions have changed, perhaps how materials might have changed, we can look at where actually are people getting their clothing from. Both urban and rural areas had very big second-hand clothing trades if you were sort of working class. Because what you also found was with industrialisation, you do get an increase in the availability of ready-made clothes. Women were earning a wage. We can look at Hardy's mum as a great example of that earlier on in the century as well. So there was agency going on, I think, in urban and rural areas to varying different extents, I think. We have this idea of England as some sort of a rural idyll of many different, almost mini cultures in different rural areas. It's really interesting to think about what happens to that when you do go to the city. You're getting all these small communities who've been very close for generations, perhaps, coming together in these very big urban areas. Everything's the same. And I think that's a really interesting way, in comparison to thinking about these small rural industries. Perhaps there are local practices, local almost identities perhaps portrayed as almost through the sort of perhaps local fashions and local customs. What happens to that when these villages, some people, they move away into these towns, and the towns are the areas that are really growing in comparison to these seemingly still and trapped in time rural areas where we haven't got this sense of progress.
Hardy basically talks about how Dorset is about 40 years behind London and London is about 5 years behind Paris, and how there's almost this kind of like hierarchy of fashion is passed all the way out from kind of the height of fashion in Paris right through to kind of Puzzle Town on the outskirts of Dorchester. And that's the point at which it hits like the rural labourers he's talking about. And also, you know, his mother, although his mother kind of almost like frog hops some of it, I think. And so moving on to his mother, because I think she's a really interesting character. So his mother is, she's born in a family where when they're growing up, they're too poor to have shoes and they're on the poor law relief. And her father dies when she's very young. And so it's really not a very affluent family at all. So I think it's quite interesting to look at her because you wouldn't expect her to be wearing anything particularly fashionable. She becomes a builder's wife. But we have on display in Poole Museum this stunning fragment of silk taffeta with this beautiful tile pattern on it of kind of lots and lots of diagonal lines in a kind of greys and blues and browns. And just, yeah, Esther, how unusual is it to have someone who hasn't had shoes growing up then walking around in a silk dress for their wedding day?
Yeah, I think she's a fascinating character. I mean, she grew up, we would not expect her to be particularly educated, and yet she was highly literate. Dante was amongst one of her favourite writers. That's very highbrow culture, and I think this is something that she obviously really instilled in Hardy. So she's a fascinating example. So when I think she's wearing a silk wedding dress, it almost has surprised me because I think she's a really, really fascinating character.
And there's also a source that says about her tambourine gloves and doing mantua making, and that's another thing I just want to add. Like, is this mantuas as in mantua gown that you have in the 18th century? Is this a modern term that's kind of been adapted from that? And how is that also tying into not just literacy in the sense of reading, but also material literacy of understanding how to make these garments?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've personally only heard the term mantua with regard to the 18th century. It could be that there is something to do that in the 19th century. But as you say, there is a real material literacy here. The wedding dress, the actual material and the pattern is very typical for what I would probably expect to see. If you were to look at fashion plates, for example, I'm sure you'd see that sort of fabric in a very sort of 1840s typical sort of silhouette. I mean, looking at the picture as well of her with Hardy as a baby, she's wearing another incredibly fashionable dress. The silhouette, you can see the skirts and the layers of the fabric. So I do think that Hardy's mum was a woman who was aware of ongoing fashion trends. It's interesting to think about where maybe she got her ideas from for her wedding dress. She did marry a master mason and she did have some disposable income. She had been earning for a long time, and certainly the other sort of material evidence of her fashion in, you know, the next sort of decade or so of her life does indicate she was a woman who did care about how she looked.
And so it's almost as if every single tool she has available to her, she's trying to project that kind of that image of being several steps up the ladder higher than she is.
A girl working in service, she would have been open to seeing all the guests come to the house, and therefore would have been given a kind of aspiration, I suppose, a bit like watching TV or something, or movies in later periods. You would see those people and how they dress, and you might aspire to that. And it also occurred to me that perhaps the silk for her wedding dress was actually a gift from her employees. But when we're talking about that Dorchester being, 10 years, 40 years behind London and all the rest of it, I think that the idea that it's the poverty of information or materials that are available to people more than the poverty of ambition.
So going on to, we've covered Jemima in great depth, but I think it's quite interesting. It seems that she passes on this love of fashion to her daughter Kate, and we have on display Kate's beautiful red silk taffeta dress, and it just kind of shimmers. It's just glorious. And so it's really interesting. And it's got like a kind of little raised collar to it, and then it's buttoned down the front and then got a small bustle at the back. And Jo actually had the privilege of mounting this at Salisbury Museum.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And also in doing that, you get to see the workings of it, because dresses of that period, whilst they look terribly elegant on the stand, how they sit is so dependent on the construction and the underpinnings to create the shapes. And of course, one of the interesting things about working in museums is that we don't have a body to put the clothes on, so we have to sort of fake what things like a corset or a bustle might have done in order to create that lovely shape that we get. But yes, some of the insights are just how complex the pleating around the waist is, and the dress is a bustle dress, so it has a bottom that sticks out rather rather than being a rounded skirt. And there are a number of pads underneath the back of the skirt to just give this extra lift to the bottom. And in fact, we had to put an additional pad in there as well, like a roll around the waist to just support the heaviness of that skirt and not to pull too much on the waist. And also, as I say, to create that volume that we required in the back. And yeah, the jacket, it has a belt on the inside to hold it really tight, and then a lot of very, very tiny and very fiddly buttons to do up. And the other thing I remember about it actually is that it has a leg of mutton sleeve, so the sleeves puff up, and to help hold its shape we had to put quite a lot of padding inside, tissue paper and things. So it'd be interesting to think about how Kate wore that dress and how she kept those sleeves voluminous. I suppose it's a bit like the puff sleeves we see today in fashion, but yes, they need to sort of remain puffed up. So yes, it was interesting seeing it and dressing it and thinking about the technical aspects of it.
Well, and one of the interesting things is I've read her diary entry where she talks about, she did a lot of cycling. The whole family did a lot of cycling, actually. And she talks about cycling from her house into Dorchester, and Hardy's home was halfway between the two. And so she says she got rained on halfway to town, stops at Hardy's house, takes off all her clothes, dries them in front of the fire, and then gets back on her bike and goes on into town and finishes off her shopping. And I'm really hoping it's not in this silk dress.
I know.
It might be worth looking for the water stains on it. But I mean, because was this the kind of thing, Esther, that you think people would have been wearing on a day-to-day basis?
I would expect this sort of thing to be worn, maybe walking more daytime, but by somebody who doesn't really have anything practical to do, which obviously is complete contrast to her own family's background, but certainly not the sort of thing one would typically expect for rural school teachers.
I think the colour is one of the things that really marks it out, because it's that really beautiful, dark, rich red, which would only have been the result, I assume, of the sort of new developments in dyes that allow these sort of very rich, saturated colours that happened in the sort of mid-19th century. But it's that, to me, that marks it out as something slightly different, perhaps, to what you might expect a governess to wear.
She doesn't like being put in a box. And this dress, I think, really is that kind of, I am not going to be put in a box dress.
No, I think that would fit quite well.
It wasn't just Kate Hardy's dress that you were able to mount, Jo. Can you just tell us a bit more about the other thing that you managed to get your hands on?
Yes, I was given the opportunity to dress the costume worn by Terence Stamp in the 1967 version of Far from the Madding Crowd, where he played the character of Sergeant Troy. And Sergeant Troy, iconically through all of the novels and all of the film versions of this, wears this bright scarlet red uniform. And part of what Hardy does, of course, is to differentiate the three suitors for Bathsheba by the clothing that they wear. And Sergeant Troy, in his uniform, is the kind of sexy one of the three. And in mounting the Sergeant Troy costume worn by Terence Stamp, I did a little bit of research into what would have been worn underneath it. I needed to put something underneath the costume, as we had to leave the costume open. The jacket needed to be open on the mannequin, and I needed to think about what shirt to put underneath it. And so we did a little bit of research into what regiment was Troy in and what might have been worn at the time. And in doing that, we realised that the costumier had designed an outfit that was not actually representative of the regiment that Troy was in, but in fact was just kind of reminiscent of fashion at the time. And of course, this film is made around the time that the Beatles are doing Sgt. Pepper, and that disused army uniforms have become popular in popular culture. And what we see is Terence Stamp wearing what's effectively a musician's jacket, which is kind of cropped at the waist, which would have both made him look very slim and very sexy, but also would have looked very fashionable to audiences in 1967. So it was a really interesting one to mount as a fashion historian, but also as an ex-costume maker, to think about the different ways that costumiers portray characters in film.
Yeah, because it's just really interesting how, I think we were just saying before we started recording about how there are so many different adaptations of Hardy's Far from the Madding Crowd, and each of them always has its little kind of like stamp of what portrays it as being from that particular period. Because the reason we've got the Sergeant Troy costume is because it is on display in Wiltshire Museum, which is based in Devizes. And Devizes was actually used for about half the filming locations for that film. And so that's that kind of direct link there. But it's weirdly juxtaposed with these costumes that we have that are actual 19th century costumes associated with the Hardy family. And so I think in a weird way, like, because doesn't it have like a magnetic popper?
Yeah. I mean, it's made as a costume, and it's not made as a historical recreation, even a historical recreation of the wrong type of uniform. I mean, the fabric of the trousers is kind of has got some elasticated qualities that definitely wouldn't have been around at the time. The buttons are all wrong. Everything about it is a theatrical representation and not historically accurate costume.
I know, Esther, this is a particular area you love delving and deep diving into. Is there anything else you'd like to add here about Hardy and the way that he's been portrayed in film?
Yeah, I think firstly, it's really interesting to highlight the fact that when we watch period films, we watch history being presented on screen. We're also watching what the contemporary time period of the filmmakers, what they think about that particular era of fashion, of history, as you were saying, Jo, about Terence Stamp's costume and the sort of the fashion context of the time for that. And I think it's so fascinating seeing that costume then being put into that museum environment alongside original extant garments, because you have this almost journey of people's impressions of the past and what they looked like and what they felt like. You have a film costume designed for a fictional product but set within a real time period, which really does not represent the time period at all. But to those viewers, when that film was released, that represented the time period. You go into that exhibition now and you can see, oh, well, this is real material evidence from the 19th century. And then it's within it's all together within an exhibition created in the 2020s. What does our current society think about these costumes and these worn garments? Do we think of the worn historic garments as a sort of type of costume? How do our views on fashion affect the way we consume both the exhibition as a whole and those individual garments and their stories, whether real or fiction? And I think there's some really interesting relationships that I think that exhibition is really going to tease out between what's real and what's fictional. What do we think about the past versus what it was actually like? So I think it ties really well into our discussion. We've been talking about the ideas of fashion and identities and what people think about and stereotypes of rural versus urban. Well, what are the stereotypes of our fashion today? What's the stereotypes of 1960s fashion when Terence Stamp's costume was made? What are our stereotypes of 19th century fashion? And what was it actually like? And I like to think that in the past, people's relationships with fashion, the way they looked, the way they wanted to be perceived, actually more similar to our feelings today than I think sometimes we give credit for.
And in some ways, having something quite modern like that, it bridges that gap between, I think sometimes, like we've been, all kind of going a gooey over the red dress, but actually we can sometimes make it a bit of a kind of relic that can't be touched, can't be, you can't feel the fabric, you can't wear the fabric, you can't feel the weight of it that we were talking about. And actually something like the Terence Stamp costume, in some ways it bridges that gap, because we can then watch the film, we can see how it moves, we can see how it fits him when he's doing the sword exercises, when he's riding a horse, when he's running along, and that sense of actually seeing the clothing as clothing rather than just as a kind of like art piece.
Yeah, when objects go into museums, their kind of purpose changes and they stop becoming garments and clothing that was worn, and they become instead these kind of precious objects or works of art that are to be looked at but not to be worn. And so, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's great to see them being used and worn as clothing, even if they're not historically accurate.
So, having gone off on that lovely tangent, I think we better get back to the main man, Hardy. And we've got some really self-conscious pictures of him as like a 16-year-old on his first day of work wearing this rather shapeless garment. And then you see him starting to wear kind of tweed suits later on in his life. But I think one of my favourites is we got several pictures of him wearing these +4s, which he's wearing to go cycling, and also to pose in next to his stone that he dug up in the garden, which isn't just any old stone. I mean, it is like a Neolithic enclosure sarsen stone, but still, it's just a rock that he dug up and put in the garden. And I think it's just quite interesting seeing his relationship with clothing as well, because he doesn't, as far as we have in our collection that we have inherited from him, he doesn't seem to have ever collected this rural clothing that he talks so much about, that we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. And so, what is his relationship with this class structure? And I think it's also really interesting that what we do have that he collected was his academic gown that he was given when he got an honorary degree. And so the clothing that is important to him seems to very much be the stuff that projects a kind of middle to upper class image, very like his mother, rather than collecting or having any nostalgia for those objects, which I kind of feel I just wanted to compare with the time. And I was going to ask Jo about this, but kind of, what were other people in at the time, how were they collecting to preserve what they saw as this kind of disappearing fashions?
Yeah, so I've looked into this a little bit because my interest is in what remains in museum collections and why do certain items exist in museum collections and others not? And as we've already sort of alluded to, I've looked a lot at smock frocks, but I think there's a note somewhere that it's smock frocks and rural and the sunbonnets that you talked about earlier, which really remain in museum collections as kind of items of rural clothing of this time. And it's like, why is that and why not other stuff? I looked particularly, because I was doing some work for Guildford Museum, I looked particularly at Gertrude Jekyll, who was a gardener, a member of the arts and crafts movement, so would have been, I guess, a contemporary of Hardy, but they wouldn't have known each other. And she becomes fascinated in her kind of 60s with a rural way of life that she sees disappearing. She becomes quite slightly nostalgic about it, and she begins a collection of rural household items in order to preserve these things that she seems as somehow being more authentic, perhaps, than the industrial made objects that are being produced. Of course, she's not the one using these items or wearing the clothing, so it is completely her view of an aesthetic of the countryside rather than a kind of lived experience of the countryside. And so she begins to collect these things with this idea that they're going to disappear and they need to be preserved. But it's interesting how her view and her nostalgia shapes what's collected and what's not collected. So what we see is people's nostalgia for a past, or people's view of the past, not their own lived experience of it, influencing what they tend to collect, and therefore what we now have, and therefore how we present past today. It's an interesting one.
And so even though Hardy doesn't actually collect these items, he does seem to have a lot of nostalgia for that period and that aesthetic. And so he talks to us about things like the hiring fairs that they used to have on Candlemas, and how all the workers would line up along the road with something in their hat, like whether it was a bit of thatching straw or a whipboard or a bit of wool, and that would indicate what kind of trade they did. And their smock frocks would also indicate that. So you get Gabriel Oak having to trade in his kind of slightly posher farming gear to wear a smock frock to basically present himself as wanting labour of that period. And Hardy, through his writing, he captures that kind of smocked, crook-holding population. And his massive criticism is that he feels that the railways are eroding that. And so he says, look, the women are starting to wear like hats with flowers and feathers and beads in their hair and wearing these heeled boots. And he sees that as not only being aesthetically less pleasing, but also being really impractical for work. And I have to admit, I'm tempted to agree with him. I feel like trying to dig up turnips in a field in high heels with some feathers in your hat probably isn't as practical as wearing like flat boots and having a sunbonnet that protects your face from the sun. But at the same time, I feel it's slightly problematic, because is this Hardy telling kind of working people how best to work? Shouldn't they know best how to work?
Well, exactly. And also, Hardy isn't doing this work. And also, Hardy is in the position where he can elevate his position through his clothing. His clothing is suitable for his work because he's a writer. And therefore, he's taking away the agency of those people to want to dress differently in order to either be fashionable or improve their situation or to not look like their parents, all the reasons that we want to choose our own clothing today. But I think, again, going back to the smock frock, he talks about this change from sort of impractical items that he sees as the right sort of thing to be worn to, impractical items. But actually, the smock frock dies out because it becomes completely impractical when agriculture becomes mechanised. It's a voluminous item that gets caught up in the machinery. It can only really be worn in that unmechanised world. And therefore, it becomes more of a signifier that this world is changing than it is anything to do with practice. And I really don't think Hardy can comment on what working women in the fields should be wearing. And I'm sure they weren't actually wearing their feathers and their high heels in the fields, because I'm sure they would have wanted to preserve them actually for best. So I think we have to perhaps take some of that with a pinch of salt.
Well, and it seems a bit hypocritical that he's accusing the next generation of doing exactly what his mother did, who seems to have constantly been wearing impractical clothing.
To be honest, how often do we all override practical use for actually wanting to look good or appropriate? How many times have you worn shoes that are actually not terribly comfortable because they look great. I don't think people in the past were any different, really.
Well, and the ongoing British obsession with selling and buying tops that have no thermal insulating value in the depths of winter, I just don't understand. But at the same time, it still goes on. And even though I don't understand it, I can't then say, no one should be wearing thin jumpers that have no insulating value. So I'm afraid, unfortunately, in all of this, Hardy probably comes out as not really winning the argument. And so this is one of the podcast episodes I'm going to have to concede that maybe Hardy should have left well alone. But I also think it's just really fascinating having got under the skin a bit with both of you of his mother and his sister and how their personalities come out in clothing. So thank you both so much for coming on this journey through this podcast.
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Interrogating Hardy. Special thanks go out to our sponsors, Batten Solicitors, as well as our funders, Arts Council for England and the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Make sure to subscribe here if you want to catch future episodes.